What a week! The 88th legislative session has officially begun, and with it has come all sorts of drama related to increased office budgets and the rules that guide institutions like the Texas House of Representatives. The comptroller also gave us an update this week about the fiscal state of Texas. We discuss it all on episode 2 of Taxpayer Talks and even get a visit from a friend, Vance Ginn, a Ph.D. economist, to help us make sense of it all. Let's get into it.
Taxpayer Talks is brought to you by Texans for Fiscal Responsibility and is made possible by generous donations from listeners like you. If you want to support our work, you can visit texastaxpayers.com/donate to make a tax-deductible contribution today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Taxpayer Talks. This is Tim Harden, president of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, here with Jeremy Kitchen, our executive director. It's been a wild week this week, Jeremy. What's been going on the last couple of days?
Yeah, this week's been pretty interesting. Obviously, it is no secret that the 88th legislative session has officially begun, right? Lawmakers are back in town. And what is it when lawmakers are back in town? Your liberties are not safe.
That's
right. Hide your wallets, hide your kids, everything.
Yeah. So, it's been a busy week. Usually the first week is really busy. And so on Tuesday, they swore in, they took the speaker vote, which we're going to talk about. Day before that, the comptroller is constitutionally bound to give a biennial revenue estimate. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit with Mr. Vance Ginn. And of course, we had the rules battle. Today, we're recording this Wednesday. So that's what we're going to kind of cover today. So let's start with the swearing in and the speaker vote. Tell everybody what happened on Tuesday.
Yeah, so of course, we're going to primarily be talking about the House of Representatives, but it's important to at least mention that, of course, the Senate starts at the same time. It's just less exciting. Most of everything they do is it's more of a formality. They've done most everything behind the scenes. So for those purposes, we'll be talking primarily about the House. But, day one, right, they operate under kind of a temporary organizational sphere. You have the Secretary of State is who comes in, right, to swear everyone in, because they technically don't have a speaker of the House. And then, of course, as soon as they were sworn in, the first record vote they take for the entire legislative session is on a speaker. And, there was back in November, you had an announcement by TFR taxpayer champion Tony Tinderholt, right, that he was going to challenge the incumbent 𝗧𝗔𝗫𝗘𝗥 to the seat of House Speaker. Of course, there was no requirement that he follow through with that, but he in fact did. And so, of course, what you had was the first record vote. Tony, Representative Tinderholt, brought it to the floor, and I think I forget what the final tally was. I think it was 145 lawmakers, Republican and Democrat, voted in favor of the incumbent, 𝗧𝗫𝗘𝗥, and I believe it was only 3, which included, of course, Representative Tinderholt himself, who voted for Tony Tinderholt. And so now we're operating under a speaker. Speaker 𝗧𝗫𝗘𝗥 was, of course, successfully reelected, and that'll be for the remainder of the session and interim of the 88th legislature.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note, we did a pretty long interview with Representative Tinderholt not too long ago in the fall, and he kind of explained his motivations behind why he ran for speaker. And he was leaning heavily as a Republican on the Republican Party platform, and the fact that, especially last session under Phelan, he felt as though the Republican priorities were not dealt with, and he was fearful that things like the priority of Democrat chairing committees was not going to be dealt with this go round as well. So this was really the reasoning behind him running. And so he did lose pretty handily. So he had, like I said, 3, I believe it was 𝗧𝗔𝗫𝗏𝗧𝗏, Slayton, and Tinderholt, who all cast votes for him. So that kind of brought us to the next showdown. So they swear in the speaker and they do a bunch of procedural stuff, and then they decided to do rules the day after. And so they typically take up a housekeeping resolution, and they take up the House rules. These are HR 3, I believe, was a housekeeping, and HR 4 was the House rules. And so they dealt with the housekeeping resolution first. And I would say the major thing, there's 2 major things that happened in the housekeeping resolution. One was they decided decided to increase allocations to office budgets. And so if y'all don't know how the House and Senate both work, the Senate just kind of passes in kind of an open thing. It's SR1, I think, was theirs. They increased their budgets as well, I think like 46%, which is actually really common in the Senate. The Senate actually every session usually bumps themselves up really nicely, which we would argue is not a very good steward of tax dollars. The House usually has a fight over because it's more public. And like you said, it's a little more exciting. And so the original resolution, they're allocated, I believe last go run was 15,200 and something. And so the resolution read they were going to bump it up to 17. And then Representative Metcalf came and offered an amendment and bumped it up to 1950, which ultimately made it about a 26% increase. And they also slipped in some language that basically talked about using state dollars for political purposes. And this was actually used, and we'll get to this, this was used to kind of prevent the Democrat chair. Now there's probably some constitutional issues there, but this was kind of their way of codifying it to make it easy to overrule any vote and to hide Republicans who didn't want to take a vote. But before we get there, let's just kind of talk about office allocations, and we are scoring this, and we were opposed to this. So let's talk quickly why we've historically opposed office allocation increases in the House.
Yeah, I think it's important, right? From the outset, you and I are both former legislative staff, right? So we know how this works as former chiefs of staff, right? Certainly we had our hands in kind of how the operating budgets on the House side, right, certainly work, what you're allocated monthly, which is what you alluded to earlier. And of course, it's also important to note, at least on the House side, not to get too in the weeds, right? But they do have a provision in the rules that says there is a cap, right? So what they essentially did was increase a cap, right? That an individual, right, staff member can make, right, in any individual office. Okay. Now you are also allowed to have one staff person, right, bust that cap, meaning make more than whatever that recommended cap is, right? Obviously, all the books have to line up at the end of the day. They can't spend more than they're allocated. But the biggest takeaway here, right, and of course you wrote about this, and the reason this organization's always kind of been opposed to it is, look, you're essentially growing government by increasing the salaries, right, of staff members, bureaucrats, right? We're former bureaucrats, but bureaucrats, right, in these offices at the expense of taxpayers, right? When the budget bill comes up, right, this cycle, which will likely be end of March, early April, right, there are provisions in there for how much the legislature itself gets appropriated. Now, what will be interesting to see is, do they increase their own appropriations, right, to suffice for these raises and what have you? So, we'll see when we get there. But as you wrote about in your article, it's we're giving raises, and of course they cite, right, the need for it because of inflation. But as you handily pointed out, right, they raised it beyond what the inflation rate is, right? So you have these staffers who, some myriad of staffers will be essentially profiting off of this, and they talk about it. Well, we need to keep quality staff and what have you. And look, that I will absolutely agree that there's definitely a struggle asking folks to live in the city of Austin, one of the highest, right, place. It costs a lot to live in this part of Texas, absolutely. But look, other states do this with less staff, right? It's important to also talk about that. And of course, we're not even mentioning the Senate, which has just egregiously, cycle after cycle, right, appropriated more and more money here. There's a way to do this, certainly. And, at the end of the day, taxpayers aren't able to vote themselves a raise, right? That's where this really comes down to. And so, as you said, we put a vote notice out on it. It's likely something we're going to score on our index this cycle.
Yeah. I think just to kind of say one more piece about that, when you and I took the job, as fiscal conservatives, us being both ideologues, right? Like, I understood that when I'm stepping in to be a bureaucrat, essentially, right? I'm a public servant. I left a pretty lucrative construction company that I had started to come do this, taking a pay cut. And I know you personally, we've been friends for a long time. And I know that you had second jobs to make ends meet. You have a family. I have a family. I had second jobs the entire time. And I chose to do that because at least we tried to honor, right, the the nature of the job itself, which is we are public servants and we are stewards of tax dollars, which means I did not go be a staffer in the Texas legislature to be wealthy, right? So I knew it would not be a wonderfully glorious salary. I would imagine teachers, many government employees have this same mentality. I don't think most teachers come in saying, hey, I want to be a teacher because I want to make $120,000 a year. They understand that they're a public servant. They're using tax dollars. Could you argue for raises? Sure. But it's when you're, quote unquote, working on appropriations for everything as a staffer, in a year, in an economic downturn year, when people are being crushed, it's just it's a bad look, right? When you we just vote and give yourselves raises. I would say that's kind of getting the cart ahead of the horse. There's a way in which you can increase office allocations and be responsible. But I think you and I both know that's not typically how it's done. And they're very sloppy with how we spread money around. And so for that reason, and just the concept of the nature of the job itself being a public servant, it's just a bad year. And it's bad optics, right? To give yourself a 26% raise, and we say raise not because the money goes directly towards raises, but the reality is it's an office budget. But I would say, what would you say, 80 or 90% of that goes to salaries, right? And so really what we're talking about, when we're talking about office allocations, yeah, sure, you buy some supplies with it and you do a couple other things with it. But for the most part, the vast majority of it, we're talking salaries here. And so if we're talking an increase in allocation, we're talking increase in salaries to bureaucrats or to legislative staffers. And so, I
think it's worthwhile to mention, right? Because this is constant confusion you always see is we are not talking about lawmaker salaries, right? And stipends. This is strictly staff or people that work for lawmakers, right? So lawmakers, they have a constitutionally set a limit as to what they get paid. It's a separate pool of money, right? Separate budget, operating budget, all that sort of stuff. So.
Yeah, and it's also good to announce that they don't make anything, dude. I don't know if they bumped it since then, but it was like $7,500 a year or something like that.
I think it was like $600 a month. I think so. Whatever that equals out, per year.
And so we will, and we like that, and that is part of that servant mentality. And you don't hear any lawmakers really complaining about their salary. They understand that this is pretty much a volunteer thing. You're making $600 a month, and they get per diem, but they're not really making profit off of that. So ultimately, we had two people, I think, vote against the housekeeping resolution. I think it was 𝗧𝗫𝗪holt and Slayton who voted against that. So that passed overwhelmingly, and they moved on to the House rules. So you want to kind of break down kind of the intro to the House rules and how that went down?
Yeah, there's a lot here, right? So, I believe the rules resolution was authored by Representative Todd Hunter, who has kind of authored this sort of thing previously. For those that have maybe tuned into previous legislative cycles, what normally happens, right, is a few months before the legislative session, you'll have the House Administration Committee normally kind of hosted this kind of informal hearing where they invite their colleagues, right, lawmakers, to come in and offer proposals for the committee to hear. Normally what happens, there's no requirement, by the way, that lawmakers do that, right, at least officially. But normally what happens is that committee kind of puts together a package, right, of what they think maybe if there are going to be changes, what that rules resolution change kind of summary would be, right, which is what you saw in House Resolution 4 today, the rules package. Inevitably, right, this comes with there's still going to be attempts by lawmakers to try to amend those rules, right, to benefit maybe one party over another or benefit one kind of philosophical, bent over another and what have you. But we saw a lot of the same amendments we've seen previously. So I say all that because the big thing that most people, at least listening to this, are maybe interested in, certainly people that are tuned to Twitter, right, and kind of the state media sphere, is that everyone knew there was going to be at least a few, right, proposed amendments that dealt specifically with preventing the minority party, which is right now currently the Democrat Party, right, the minority party from chairing House committees. And so kind of wherever you are on that philosophical bent, right? Republicans control the state legislature. They control the House. They've done so for 2 decades. And so you've got kind of the activist wing of the Republican Party. We heard a lot about this when we were, of course, at their state convention this year, they're angry, right? They're upset that in a majority, Republican majority controlled legislature, that the minority party controls some committees. And as a result, I think it's almost like 1/3 of the committees, right? 13 committees, if I remember right, last cycle. And as a result of that, some of their legislative priorities in the past have died, right? That's kind of where they pinned the blame. So I say all that because there was an effort. You had the Republican Party of Texas make it one of their 8 legislative priorities this cycle to what they called ban Democrat chairs. You had a bunch of activists that were set to come down, right, travel down to the Capitol. I believe they originally planned for Thursday, but you still had a good amount if you watched the gallery today that were sitting in there, certainly visiting lawmakers' offices, right, to try to influence their Republican lawmakers to vote in favor of any of these amendments that came up. And there were 2 or 3 of them that dealt with this. But I think in summary for that specific thing, all of those efforts were defeated, and wouldn't you know it, there were no record votes on it, right? Because they had points of order ready to go. So I know I've been long-winded on that, but I think it's important to understand kind of the order of events, right? I think unbeknownst maybe to activists, certainly, right, that weren't following along, and unbeknownst to maybe some lawmakers, right? There was a provision in the House Resolution 3 that you alluded to earlier, the housekeeping resolution, that that was successfully adopted, obviously, that dealt specifically with making sure that office members' office budgets and resources, right, all their materials and everything that they get were not being used for, quote, political purposes. It was pretty, I'm not gonna say specific, it was pretty broad. You know, I think to our credit, we pointed that out on Twitter. That was like, oh, this is an interesting addition. But, you know, in the citation for the points of order that they brought against the ban Democrat chairs amendments, I think that were all offered by Representative Brian Slayton, if I remember right, to what they brought against it, the points of order that they brought, which were sustained, right? So those efforts were killed. They cited the passage of the resolution before, you know, just an hour before, and I believe some attorney general opinions to kind of come up this weird reasoning as to why, because it's now a political reason, they wouldn't be able to ultimately do this. And so the efforts, at least currently, to ban Democrat chairs were defeated.
Mr. Speaker, members, I think you'll recognize this amendment. I filed the same amendment last session. I'm proud to be up here offering it again. This amendment will require the Speaker to appoint committee chairs from the majority party. This amendment fulfills one of the legislative priorities of the Republican Party of Texas, will honor the will of the people of Texas by ensuring that they actually receive the leadership that they vote for on Election Day.
Mr. Guerin, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry, please.
Please state your inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, did the House just adopt a housekeeping resolution for this session?
That is correct, sir.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Is that housekeeping resolution now in effect?
It is now in effect, yes, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call a point of order against further consideration of this amendment.
Please bring your point of order down front. Representative Guerin raises a point of order against further consideration of the Slayton Amendment on the grounds that the amendment seeks to authorize actions prohibited by the housekeeping resolution. The subject of the amendment, as stated by the author in his layout, is to prohibit the Speaker from appointing certain members as certain chairs, specifically those members who are elected as nominees of an identified political party. The author additionally stated that the purpose of the amendment was to implement the directive of a political party's state executive committee. The housekeeping resolution adopted by the House earlier today codified the constitutional rule that House resources may only be used for public purposes and may not be used for political purposes. Attorneys General John Cornyn and Greg Abbott have both held that political parties are not public entities, but are political instrumentalities. Is that even a word? Sorry. The amendment would require a speaker to use public resources, including staff time and government facilities, on behalf of one political instrumentality. This obviously would require the speaker to violate the housekeeping resolution. Once adopted, a House resolution is not subject to collateral attack The Slayton Amendment effectively seeks to amend the previously adopted housekeeping resolution, which is not permitted under House precedent. It may only be offered by way of direct amendment to that measure. Accordingly, the point of order is well taken and sustained.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Schaefer, what purpose?
Parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Are the House Republican caucus and the House Democrat caucus contemplated anywhere in our House rules or the housekeeping resolutions?
That is not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Does the Republican caucus and the Democrat caucus have office space in the Capitol that uses state electricity?
That is not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Is the House Republican caucus a political instrumentality?
That is not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I think we saw, it was like the Republican Party of Texas is having a press conference with some members here either tomorrow or the next day to try to address this because it's one of their 8 priorities. But as of right now, it looks like we're going to go another session where that precedent, the recent precedent like that, is going to continue. So,
yeah, I think it's telling, what they did in the housekeeping. Specifically, it was Representative Charlie Garen who came up and called the point of order on Slayton. And before he called,
who's a Republican, we should know.
Who's a Republican out of the Fort Worth area. And, he came up and before he called the point of order, he said, is the housekeeping resolution currently enacted, basically, or something along those lines, right? And so he was making sure and kind of saying, basically, showing the hand and saying, hey, we just passed this thing to block you, essentially. Now, I think it's telling because, whether or not the point of order would have been sustained without that provision, maybe they probably would have leaned on the AG rulings and some other stuff. I'm sure they would have, right? But what it tells us is they purposely put that in the housekeeping resolution. And who's they? Speaker Phelan and his team, who is driving the train on, when they do the rules and everything else. They purposely put that provision in there, knowing that they were going to use that in order to call point of orders on any of these amendments, which they knew were coming from Slayton and probably a few others who were talking.
It should be noted too, I don't want to interrupt you, but look, like to my recollection, no lawmaker, at least publicly, right, from the back mic, asked questions about that language being inserted in there, which I find interesting too. So, I don't want to ascribe any nefarious action there. Like maybe they just didn't know. Right. I don't know if the goose was cooked already, if the theater was set or what have you, but I don't believe anyone asked questions about that.
No, they didn't. They just kind of, got in line and voted for it. And I would assume, if there was nefarious purposes there, that's exactly what they were hoping on. But I, at least in my opinion, think that it was pretty obvious that they were prepared for these amendments. Most of the amendments were not even allowed to be laid out. They interrupted them. Most of these were Charlie Garen, and I think Moody did one, and there's a few other ones who there's a bunch of various movements, not just the Democrat chairs, but the one on Marxism and I think gender ideology and stuff. But it was very clear that they already knew these were coming. They already knew they were going to call point of orders, and this whole thing was kind of a show, right? And so that it's significant, and I think we should at least point that out, that the fact that Garen asked if the housekeeping resolution was enacted before he called the point of order shows that the purpose of that provision was, at least in part, to deal and to protect the Republicans from taking a vote on the minority chair issue. And so, that's my opinion. That looks like the way it worked out. But since no one asked questions, we will not know, right? Nobody. And
we also won't know, which is likely purposeful, right? Is there was no record vote taken on any of those that we were talking about because they had successfully sustained points of orders on them. Obviously, you talked about a few of the other amendments, but there were some, I think for our purposes, good accountability and transparency proposals that were put forth. Some did get votes, which we talked about at least on Twitter for those that don't follow us there. But it's kind of stuff that we've seen previously, right? I think you had Representative Tinderholt bring some pretty decent accountability, transparency ones, dealing with, getting rid of the practice of tagging and the calendars committee processes, right? Or making sure that bills that maybe were heard but never got a vote in committee, that there's a timeline in which they have to get a vote, so we can at least see who in committee didn't want it, right? Didn't want it to pass. Things like that, things where that lawmakers currently use the process to hide behind. I think you had some good faith efforts by people like Representative Tinderholt to try to bring those actions to light. Those were defeated, sadly. As well. And you had one of my personal pet favorite, which is, I think a lot of transparency needs to go into the video and archival process for videos. You had one by, I believe it was Slayton that offered it, that required that if I'm viewing a video broadcast, as I imagine many of our watchers might be if they're tuning into the legislature, you have no idea who's talking. There's no little lower thirds that comes up and says the name. And so all he simply wanted to do was require that a banner show up, right? To say, who is this rep that's talking? And lawmakers resoundingly, I believe that was actually subject to a point of order that was successful, right? And they kind of wiggled their way out of that, which just kind of shows you just how they love to operate in the shadows. And I think that's really unfortunate for Texas taxpayers.
Yeah, I think the only thing we haven't spoken about is the First Amendment that was brought by Hunter, I believe, which was an amendment. He basically was trying to create a process in which, long story short, the Democrats took off and broke quorum. And so they wanted a process in which they could enact a punishment, essentially, if you decide to break quorum. So a process in the House by which they could ultimately expel them if they wanted to, although it was very hazy, and he was very hazy in all his answers on how it would work. I think, his general opinion was we want the House to make the decision at the time. And so, Democrats were up there kind of fighting against that as you would expect them to do. And it was basically a close to a party line vote, I believe. And so I
think there were 3 Democrats that voted for it, if I remember. Right.
Yeah. And so that was kind of their effort. If the Democrats decide to break quorum, we will see how effective that rule is. I think that was something that was asked for really in the special sessions last go around, but they decided to deal with it in the rules. And so probably is a good amendment, but we will see if they break quorum, if it's effective at actually bringing them back to make them work or not. The thing
I think that's worthwhile to note here too, right, is and you saw the exchange. I won't talk too much about that, but the new Democrat caucus chairman is State Representative Trey Martinez Fisher, right? Democrat, I believe, from the San Antonio area, who in the past has been a pretty decent rules kind of connoisseur, right? If you will. And it was an interesting back and forth as the new Democrat caucus chair. He had an interview, I think a week or two ago, where he was basically asked, would y'all break quorum again? And he, of course, did not say no, right? Why would you get rid of, none of them got punished for it last time. So why would you get rid of your ace of spades, right? Or whatever. And, I thought that was interesting because he had an exchange with Hunter today, trying to kind of establish some dialogue, if you will, for any inevitable legal fight that might come, right, as a result, if this was ever used and that sort of stuff. So the biggest takeaway for me on this, by the way, is I think some of that stuff, I think I read later on Twitter after this exchange, that some of the stuff that Representative Cody 𝗧𝗪𝗓 was fighting for, he was kind of the guy last year in the special sessions trying to get some of these kind of things added in because everyone was under the impression that they didn't have enough, right, to actually go after these lawmakers. I believe he successfully got a lot of those in with this amendment with Representative Hunter. So
yeah, so we will see. The rules have been passed. The housekeeping resolution was passed. We are really ready to do business in the House and in the Senate. But for now, let's backtrack a couple of days to Monday, and the comptroller releases BRE, and we have a conversation we had with Mr. Vance Ginn. So let's go to that real quick.
Do you hate property taxes and want to actually own your home? Please like and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you're aware of future videos on how we can eliminate property taxes in Texas.
Hey, Vance, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well, Tim. How are you?
Good to see you. Of course, we wanted to talk about the comptroller and his release of the biennial revenue estimate. So I want to kind of hand it over to you and to kind of explain to our viewers, what the BRE is and what we found out on Monday.
Well, Tim, there's a lot of details that we can go into, but a top line kind of numbers and sense of what we have here is the BRE is the biennial revenue estimate, which is where the comptroller comes out the day before session starts. Everybody's ready for it. And he tells the legislature, this is how much revenue that you're going to have available to appropriate during the legislative session. We've got a balanced budget amendment, right? So we're fortunate to be one of those states. Almost every state has one, not at the federal level, of course. They run up massive deficits, but each state has these balanced budget amendments. And it means that you've got to only spend a certain amount of money. And that is what was released on Monday, January 9th by the comptroller. So he's given the amount out there of about $188 billion for 24-25. And so it's a massive amount of money. It's a huge increase from the previous BRE, nearly 30% increase. And so they've got a ton of money to spend or provide tax relief,
I think it's important. I get this question. Speaking last night, I got this question, right? It's like, where does that money come from, right? Like we know, we've talked about it several times, the state doesn't levy the property tax. So where do they get that revenue?
The vast majority of the revenue comes from sales taxes. You're talking about over 50%, nearly 60% of the general revenue comes from sales taxes. But it also comes from the franchise tax, which is a tax on having a franchise or a business in Texas. It comes from a number of other sources that will go to general revenue overall. That's not dedicated to, let's say, the state highway fund or other areas. That is really a general revenue fund that we're talking about now. And one thing I should mention here kind of up front too, is that he said for the 2022-23 biennium budget period that we're in now, there looks to be a $32.7 billion surplus, just a massive increase, which is about $5 billion more than what he said just in July of 2022, just a few months ago. And so that's how fast the economy's been growing. And, as an economist, right, I like to look at these numbers and see what's happening. We've got an unemployment rate of 4% in Texas. We've had personal income growth of 8.2% growth in the third quarter of 2022. So a lot of things in the economy have been looking pretty good. Even though across the nation, things have looked a little dire. I think we're more of in a national recession, but Texas has been able to withstand that. And these numbers from the comptroller have indicated that as well. He also noted that, look, in 2023, we're going to have a slowdown, if not a recession in Texas. I think while we can withstand some of the nonsense out of D.C., we're not immune to that nonsense, right? Between the Federal Reserve's actions and Congress's overspending. And so some of that is going to come home to roost here in Texas as well, with fewer jobs, right? And people being laid off and things of that nature. And so he has brought down that growth rate in 2023 and then come back to an increase in 2024. So something for us to consider. But even with that, guys, we've still got a nearly 30% increase. So it's a massive amount of revenue coming in.
And so you're probably familiar with TFR's position on the surplus. It's very familiar with what you dealt with while you were at TPPF, using surplus dollars to buy down M&O compression. And so at the time when we first started talking about that at the end of last session, I think the surplus was around $8 billion. Then it grew to 15. Then it grew to 27, and now we're at almost $33 billion. Yes. And so our position is that surplus is taxpayers' money. It was overcollected by the government. And so the best thing that we can do is give as much of that as possible back to taxpayers. And we would elect to do that in the form of M&O compression. There's been concerns from the lieutenant governor. He's mentioned things like a spending cap, having to break the spending cap, and there's concerns. Abbott has said, hey, we're going to do the biggest property tax cut in history. But the question remains, like, how much are we even able to spend out of that? So I just want to get your thoughts on, realistically, what is the most amount we could actually take from this to apply to property tax relief and help Texans out?
Yeah, Tim. I mean, these are key points to be thinking about right now for families at home. Look, I consider us to have an affordability crisis right now across, even Texas is having an affordability crisis with home prices and values going through the roof, interest rates going through the roof, inflation, eggs. One thing after another is hitting our pocketbooks day in and day out. And this is an opportunity for Texas legislature to say, you know what, we're going to help out Texas families. And they've already been overpaying That's really what's happening here, right? This is all our money. Taxation is theft at the end of the day, okay? So it's all of our money to pay for some limited government services that are being provided. And I think we could all agree that the government's too big now. We're spending too much, okay? But let's give that money back to the form of property tax, like you said, rate compression, which is really just means that you're lowering the rates for school district maintenance and operations property taxes. So that's the portion of the independent school district property taxes that's paying for teacher salaries, for operations of the schools, things of that nature. That's not including the debt, right? Like construction of new stadiums and new buildings and things of that nature. This is really the day-to-day operations of schools. And that portion is nearly half the property taxes that are collected across the state. And for many people, it could be even more than half of your property tax bill. And like you said, Tim, I think, but whether it be TFR or TVPF or others have said, you know what, let's find a way to eliminate, get rid of it. Right? This portion of the property tax is a good start for hopefully one day eliminating it all. But a way to do that is to use this surplus of general revenue related funds to buy down, compress, reduce that rate over time. And I think there's a good opportunity to do so right now. Not only is there the $32.7 billion of surplus for 22-23, the current budget period, but if you look at the future, the $188 billion of general revenue, if you had something like a no growth budget or something along those lines, or just a limiting to some extent, you're going to have even larger surplus going into the next biennium that could provide an even larger down payment to eliminating this big portion of the property tax as soon as possible. And that would really provide relief for taxpayers from this affordability crisis that's going on. And, the state legislature likes to point their fingers at the locals. The locals like to point their fingers at the state. And ultimately, I hope what they start pointing at is saying, taxpayers, you're getting the relief. None of this, stop this nonsense. Let's get back to the relief that's needed. And we have an ample, what people are saying, historic opportunity right now. And if it goes over the spending limit, because this current spending limit includes property tax relief, right? If you're using funding for that, I say that that's a conservative approach. It's not going to grow government. And so you should bust the spending limit. You need a simple majority vote to do so. The Republicans can do that. And there could be a massive property tax relief that's being provided. And, the governor has said 50%. So let's say it's 50%. That's about $17 billion right there. The largest property tax amount that was put towards, or the relief, the general revenue that's put towards property tax relief was back in 07-08. And that was about $14 billion. If you adjusted that for inflation, you're talking about closer to $20 billion. So for this to be the historic, right, a record-breaking property tax relief, we need something around $20 billion. So we need to at least hit 16, but keep adding more into it to really provide the property tax that I think not only to make it historic, but what taxpayers really need across the great state of Texas.
You've mentioned a lot there, Vance. I appreciate it. Certainly, I think, what we're not talking about, right, to be clear, is, we don't want to give the impression that something like this, what we're talking about or describing to here, happens overnight, right? Obviously, this takes time. There's varying, right, ideas about how long of a time that takes, depending on what spending and revenue, right, all that stuff looks like. The one thing we haven't mentioned, of course, right, is the rainy day fund, right? And I'll let you kind of talk through the comptroller's thoughts on that. But I bring that up because some of the pushback we get, not necessarily generally from even the public, some lawmakers is, well, what happens if there's an economic downturn, right? So maybe give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Jeremy, I think that's a good point. And I hear that at the Capitol all the time from conservative members and moderates and others is, how do we maintain that compression? So let's say we do come in and, let's say they cut it in half, just throw that out there for right now. They cut these property taxes in half and the rate goes down substantially by half. How do we maintain that in the next period? And what happens if there was a recession? Well, if you look back at general revenue related funds that are coming in and being collected over the last 20 years, there have really been only two periods where there were back-to-back years of declines in general revenue funds. And that was during the 02-03 recession in Texas, and then the 08-09 the Great Recession, right? So two severe recessions that we had, but then it popped right back up. And even during that time, it wasn't a huge decline in the amount of general revenue. And so even let's say we go down some in the economy, general revenue doesn't flow in fast. In fact, it goes down some. Well, that's where, to your point, you can look at the rainy day fund. The comptroller said that at the end of the current biennium in 2023, we would have a $13.7 billion amount in the rainy day fund. $13.7 billion. All right. So that's a massive amount to help to cover any sort of shortfalls we have. Oh, by the way, but it gets better. By the end of the 25 fiscal year, so the next biennium, we're talking closer to $27 billion. That's going to be in the rainy day fund. And it even goes above the cap. There's a constitutional cap on the rainy day fund of 10% of certain dedicated certain general revenue, right? And so if it goes above that 10% of certain general revenue, then it goes back into the state treasury and could be used for spending and other purposes. I would hope that it would be used for more property tax relief. But regardless, we would have, $20+ billion sitting on the sidelines to help to cover any sort of reduction in revenue. And that's really what it was created to do, was the rainy day fund, was to cover unforeseen revenue shortfall. And overall, by the way, they should also restrain spending. This is always a spending problem, not a revenue problem. So keep restraining spending. And then if they needed more money, there's also the school districts have excess reserve funds sitting on the sidelines of about $20 billion, $20 billion, that some of that's used for cash flow for day-to-day operations, but not all of that. Maybe they have an additional $6, $7, $8 billion that they could also put into that if we see that the revenue falls. Why are they sitting on that money in the first place, right? And so I think that this is overblown, that the recession or a recession is going to contribute to us not being able to maintain this. I think it's really a factor that they want to spend too much money instead.
So on the thought of recession and cutting spending, you mentioned earlier, the concept of no growth budget, which is in our Texas Prosperity Plan. And so I want to talk to you about the advantages of that. Even if, you were not able to, pass a no growth budget, but even if we move the ball and limit it to like 2 or 3%, instead of what we have right now, which was the spending cap, which is population plus inflation. Of course, inflation is at historic levels. So I think it was 12.3% was the cap, the constitutional cap this go round. So what is the advantage of moving to a more conservative metric, like either a no growth budget or a very, very small amount, like a 2% or 3% growth? What would that mean for taxpayers? And is that a feasible thing to do in Texas state government?
Initial answer is yes. It is definitely feasible to do, given the size of the budget that we have today. You could go in and find a lot of savings already. And so we're not even saying, and the no growth budget, right, just means that you need to find some efficiencies with what you were spending before. And oftentimes there's a lot of one-time expenditures that will be appropriated each session, that those are going to fall off anyway. And so that leaves you additional room to fund some growth if you need to in certain areas. So even as us being, good fiscal hawks, which I think that we are, right? That this considers growth in certain areas as those one-time expenditures fall away. And I think, we would make the case that, look, the budget's already too big. We need to cut it even more. But that's trying to be realistic given the situation that we're in. So a 2 or 3% growth budget, I think, is even more realistic and more allowing for there to be some reasonable growth in certain areas. Now, whether or not they should, that's a different question. But the more that you allow for growth, I think this is the big point, Tim, the more that you allow for growth in the spending part of it, the less we're going to have available for property tax relief. So a no growth budget, you're going to have a lot more than you would for property tax relief of additional revenue, right? That excess, that surplus, than you would if you had a 2 or 3% growth increase, or even if you had the historical rate of population inflation of 6%, of something along those lines. That's going to leave you less available each period to be able to buy down that or compress that school district M&O property tax rate. And so some of the initial calculations that I'm looking at right now, whether you looked at the 2% or 3%, or even the 6% growth rate of of spending, that kind of pushes you further and further out for the elimination. Jeremy mentioned earlier that this won't happen overnight, and it won't happen overnight. But what you could do is put a significant amount towards the down payment this time, given this historic amount that's out there, to buy down the school M&O property tax, and then keep doing that, whether it be 50% or 90%. There's some good bills out there that have showed 90%, or limiting revenue of general revenue to 104%. So you only allow for 4% growth in spending and allow for the rest of it to be used, or the vast majority of the rest of it to be used for buying down. These are the types of things that we need to be looking at to quickly eliminate the school district M&O property tax, given the affordability crisis, given even a recession. If we're going to have a deeper recession, where do you want that money? You want that in you want that money in the private sector. That's where productivity happens. That's where new job creation happens. And so that's what we really need to see here in Texas.
That's a great point. What I do hear you saying out of all of this, right? And you alluded to, like I think Tim and I mentioned it before, maybe on last week's episode or before, is like, if there's ever a reason to bust the spending cap, I don't think you'll find a conservative, maybe a taxpayer in Texas, that wouldn't support their lawmaker to bust the cap for this purpose, right? To literally provide them property tax relief that they can feel, right? That would be worthwhile to them. I guess.
And Jeremy, that's probably shocking to some people who are going to watch this, given the three of us that are talking about this right now, is we're saying to bust the spending limit. Because I've talked to some folks and they're like, well, isn't that going to set a bad precedent? And I'm like, if this sets a bad precedent for providing tax relief, then count me in, because I want that continued to happen over time. The spending limit is important because you don't want to grow government. The ultimate burden of government is how much it spends, not how much it taxes, right? Tax is just a symptom of that disease of spending. And so if we are just basically providing funding to buy down that school M&O property taxes, that's not growing government in the process.
So, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but we're talking about property taxes. You can't talk about property taxes without also talking about school finance. But even then, we're not even talking about a problem that certainly needs to be addressed, and that's spending at the local level as well. What are your thoughts on both of those things?
I think that's right. I mean, the Texas legislature, and this is one reason why I think we focus so much on the ISD M&O property taxes, because they're essentially run by the state. The state legislature determines the school finance formulas that are going to determine how much money is going out to these schools based on an allocated amount, weighted average daily attendance amount for each student, which currently is like around $14,000 per student. And so if you think about it, that fills the bucket up, the $14,000. Part of it's going to be filled by property taxes, and then the state funds in the rest. But it's all determined at the end of the day, that bucket, by the Texas legislature. And so this is already a state determined taxing situation, or spending situation, I should say. The local property tax is local in name only, right? And so it's like, look, let's just give it all to the state and allow them to spend the money that way. And ultimately, I hope for, school choice, education savings accounts, something along those lines for those dollars. But you also have a situation where other localities, cities, counties, special purpose districts, and even schools for their INS, the debt portion, are running up massive increases right now in the amount of property tax hikes that they're putting in place because they want to spend more. And, we were looking at some of the numbers here recently, just from 21 to 22, the school M&O property taxes are up about 13.1%. Overall, school district property taxes are up 13.7%. And some say, well, man, I thought we just put past House Bill 3 back in 2019 of a 2.5% limitation. But remember, that limitation of the trigger of 2019 of 2.5%, that was only for existing property. That was not new property. And we've been gangbusters new property all across this great state. And so I think we need to move to a spending limit at the local level as well. Just like we have at the state, if it's population inflation, I think we would love for it to be even less than that. Maybe it's a no growth budgets at the local level as well. But we need spending limits at the local level that covers all revenue, sales tax revenue, property tax, whether it's existing or new property, fines and fees. The spending limit should cap all of it. And the state can't just keep them from growing at all, because that would go up against the Constitution. But the way out of that is to allow for that trigger, Senate Bill 2, for example, to have that vote. If they want to go above the no new revenue rate or whatever rate you want in place, they would go out to the voters and ask them kind of for permission at the ballot for whether or not they can increase their taxes at all. And that would give them a way out. So long story short, we need spending limits that restrain spending, not only at the state level, that are strict as possible, but also at the local level. And man, we would be a dynamic economy with robust jobs. More businesses want to move here. We don't need some ridiculous Chapter 313s and Chapter 11s and everything else they want to, incentivize businesses to be here. The best incentive is to restrain spending and provide lower taxes for everyone.
Amen. Man, couldn't have said it better myself, Vance. So, focusing on the local level, you mentioned the no new revenue rate, and Jeremy and I, and even you've been in some of the conversations about, what if we let's say we did a no growth budget, or let's say we didn't do a no growth budget and we started spending the surplus and put ourselves on a path towards elimination. One of the problems that could happen if we don't restrain local spending and reform really the property tax process could be that there's a lot of little loopholes that could prolong the process, maybe even indefinitely, depending on what happens. And so, spending caps are a good idea. We've spoken about things like moving the no new revenue rate down to moving the voter approval rate down to the no new revenue rate. Right now, they're kind of a separate. Voter approval is that limit, and then no new revenue would be a net neutral levy, what that rate would actually be. And so by moving the voter approval rate down to the no new revenue rate, it would essentially be no growth, or it would trigger an election if they wanted to raise the rate that would increase the total tax levy more than neutral, right? So I guess the over question is, we have some reforms like that we've talked about. What are some other reforms on the local level, whether it be appraisal reform, that could help speed up the process of compressing M&O down to zero, or maybe some obstacles that could stand in the way if we don't deal with them as a legislator on the local level?
Yeah, no, those are good points, Tim. I like the idea of moving that rollback rate, the voter approval rate, 3.5% for cities, county, and special purpose districts, or some special purpose districts. There's a lot of carve outs too of those, right? And remember, they carved out all new property as well. I would like to see that include all property in all the jurisdictions down to the no new revenue rate. And for schools, the same thing. Instead of the 2.5% for existing property, it should include all property, and it should go down to 0% as well. So if schools want to raise their property taxes, or cities, counties, special purpose districts, they would all have to go to the voter to get approval. And there's this discussion about local control, right? And these local voter, or the local politicians who are put in place, they're elected. They're supposed to be representing us. And the problem is that they're not representing us and preserving our liberty, which is the key role for government, right? And if the state has a spending limit, why shouldn't local governments have spending limit? And if they're not going to follow through, they need to go back to the voters and say, basically, can we raise your taxes? Why is it that they can raise your taxes without having any approval at all? Why don't they just lower them every time? These are key questions that I think we think about and voters are thinking about, but these politicians are not. They have different, in economics, we talk about public choice economics, where they had different incentives. We think about it from a marginal cost, marginal benefit sort of analysis. They don't, because their marginal changes are different, because also what do they got to do? They got to win votes to get elected. They got to appeal to interest groups and everything else that puts the voters too often on the back burner. And that can't be the case. The taxpayer has to be first. And when we can get to that situation, whether it's be taking that rollback rate, that voter approval rate down to the no new revenue rate, or whether that be a spending limit. And oh, by the way, if we could put these local spending limits in place, what about this, guys? If they have a surplus, which they will, okay, their own surplus would go to buy down their own property taxes. So you could have a situation where the state is buying down the school M&O property tax, right? The largest portion, buying that down to zero over time. And then all these other local governments are buying down their own property taxes. And that would be a way for us to eliminate property taxes across the entire state. which I would love to see. I just think we'd be an economic powerhouse. No other state has that. We don't have an income tax. We have no property tax. Like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. Everybody would want to come to Texas. We have some other constraints that we need to think about, but that is the sort of situation we need to be in, so that government spending is the problem. Let's limit that, and then think about how to lower taxes until we can get them as low as possible, if not eliminated over time.
Here we are on Wednesday, day 2 of the 88th legislative session, right? 138 days left. The reality is significantly less than that, right? They won't be able to really consider bills until after March 10th. But it's concerning, and we've written about this previously. I want to get your thoughts, right? It seems like you've got kind of the big three on similar but different pages when it comes to property taxes, right? You've got, of course, the governor we alluded to earlier, right, at the gubernatorial debate at the end of September, where he talked about, I want to eliminate the school portion of the property tax, right? I want to provide the largest property tax cut in history. He said that before then and then reiterated it there at the debate. We talked about that earlier. You've got the lieutenant governor who kind of in interviews goes out of his way to say he's on the same page as the governor, but then talks about stuff that's completely different than that, which is, he seems primarily focused on increasing the homestead exemption, which of course the legislature's done a few times before, right? And then you've got, we really got our kind of first insight into House Speaker Dade Phelan's priority on this week, right? In his speech after winning re-election, where he seemed, even though he kind of alluded to providing property tax relief, he only focused on appraisal reform. I'm not someone to say that shouldn't be done, but it seems like maybe they're on slightly different pages. And of course, we're in early session, but what are your thoughts? Where do you think, if you had to prognosticate, where do you think the legislature potentially ends up here as we get towards the end of the session in May?
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the dynamics that are going on. Historically, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has been more of the conservative bulwark here, where we can rely on him to come out and come up with some good conservative policies of the big, bold moves towards property tax relief or something else. And, with his recent press release or press conference, I didn't see that. And if anything, it looked like more government spending. There was a lot of talk about expansions of government versus the property tax relief. I mean, I think he talked a little bit about how much could go towards compression, right? Rate compression, but also talked a lot about the homestead exemption, which look, the preference should always be to rate compression, because when you lower the rates, it's lowering it for everyone. The homestead is only for those who have a primary place of residency, right? That their primary home, that's the homestead, which overlooks all the businesses, secondary sort of homes, and by the way, apartment complexes and renting houses. So renters don't get any of that benefit. And so what it really does ultimately is it shifts the burden around. Because the spending's not changing, it's just changing who is going to pay for that same amount of spending. So it just shifts everything around. And so the homestead not only is not a good way to go, but it's also not really felt, because all the valuations just go up, and it moves away all of those savings. It gives away all those savings that may have happened under the homestead. So you really want to look at the rates overall. And then if you looked at what Speaker Phelan said, right? I mean, I think, again, I heard a lot of spending and growth of government with his priorities. And there was only that, like you said, only the mention of the appraisal reform. And look, there were some major appraisal reforms in 2019. This truth in taxation, where you're getting this postcard that says how much your taxes are going up. You can look online and see what the no new revenue rate was. I thought they solved that problem back in 2019, right? And so what sort of other appraisal reforms would we really need? Because ultimately, that's only one portion. It's the appraisal times the tax rate that gives you your total tax liability, right? And if you only look at the appraisal, which happens first, and you don't put the emphasis where I think it needs to be on the politicians who are making these decisions to change the tax rate, we're never going to get control over the amount of taxes that we're actually paying over time. And so, again, I thought that was not much to hear. It's really been the governor, right? Governor Abbott, who has talked about cutting the property tax in half, putting on a path elimination, those sort of things, which is not necessarily what we've heard a lot in the past. I hope that there is the follow through during session. I know with talking with a lot of legislators, they're really passionate about using most, if not all, I'd love to see them use all, but most of this money, the surplus, for property tax relief. And so I hope that will put the pressure on them and the leadership to really do something big, because we do have a historic opportunity here.
So, Jerry, we're going for about 30, 35 minutes. Do you have anything else you want to ask Vance before we end?
I mean, I don't necessarily think so. The only thing I would mention, and right, Tim and I talked about this before, is, the governor's going to give his State of the State address probably first week of February, somewhere around there, right? Yeah. And I think the big thing we'll be looking out for, on top of some of the other priorities, is, does he mention property taxes? And to your point is what you were just saying, right? It seems to be the governor kind of taking the lead on this go around. Who knows, right? We're only day 2 into the legislative session when we're recording this, but it'll be interesting to see. I just, ultimately, kind of, as we talk about the session and spending and what have you, they've got a lot of stuff, right, to take care of. We're trying to, simultaneously do school choice, right, and talk about school finance, while also addressing property taxes, while also addressing, all these litany of things. And so I think that where I would end, and hopefully you would agree, is, trying to encourage folks to, right now, is when you contact your lawmakers about this sort of stuff, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. This is like I said, it's a historic opportunity that we all need to be pressuring folks to saying, look, this is the time when we need substantial property tax relief. We need school choice. We need to end taxpayer funded lobbying, all these other things that are key as well. But if we don't use these funds to provide property tax relief, what will it be used for? Growing government, increasing government spending, and then we're never going to get on a path to eliminating some of these property taxes that we're paying, that are immoral taxes, that are costly to our economy and everything else. We really got to start that process now. I would really suggest as well that the governor make property tax relief an emergency item. This is an emergency. This is an affordability crisis that is not going to improve. With the national recession that's happening, with inflation still out there, this is the opportunity for the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and members to provide relief now for folks across the state. And so if this was an emergency item, they could do it right away and get this process started without having to go through all the other traps of going through how much they're going to spend out of the rest of the surplus. I know that's a big ask, right? Because usually they'll want probably border security and some of these other things. But I do believe that this is an emergency situation that could be tackled by using the surplus funds to buy down the school M&O property tax.
Yeah, I think, the comptroller, Patrick, I've heard say this, you've said this, TPPF said this. This is a historic, once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but certainly from our perspective, it is a historic, once in a lifetime opportunity to provide historic property tax relief and elimination, and to put us on a path towards actually owning our house. And so I'm excited to see what the session holds. Of course, we're going to go through a little lull period here, but we will, of course, be talking with you throughout the session. We appreciate you being with here, Vance. Appreciate your insights. And just want to thank all of our viewers. We will see you again next week as we really get session rolling. We appreciate y'all being with us this evening.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. For even more content, head over to our website, texastaxpayers.com, where you can find all of our written content, the Fiscal Responsibility Index, and a whole host of resources that can help you navigate the already ongoing 88th legislative session. Make sure while you're there to subscribe to the Fiscal Note and vote notices to stay informed about issues that affect your wallet. Thanks. Hey, you made it to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that way you're notified next time we post a video and update to the channel. Thanks again.